Amen. Open your Bibles, if you would please, to two places today. We're going to be in Exodus 28 and Hebrews chapter 4. Exodus 28 and 29 for much of it, and we'll end up in a few places, but primarily in Hebrews 4 at the end. So we've been doing Exodus for a while, and I know that the first chapter of Exodus, if you've read Exodus in one sitting or a number of close sittings in the span of a few days or sittings, then you know that the first half of Exodus is pretty exciting. A lot goes on. Big time stuff. Things we remember easily about Exodus. And you'd think that all those kinds of things, like baby Moses being saved in a basket among the reeds, or God revealing himself to Moses in the burning bush, or the 10 plagues culminating in the Lord sparing the Israelites from death, or God leading them by cloud and fire, or providing manna and water, or, I don't know, the Exodus itself. Moses leading the Israelites across the Red Sea to free them from slavery and oppression in Egypt, to defeat Pharaoh's army. You'd think that those kinds of things are the most important parts of the book. But what's interesting is, in this second half of Exodus, where we've been spending our time lately, there's a lot of words for things that seem to us less important, not as cool, not as exciting as all those big things in the first half of the book. The things that we so easily remember about Exodus and go, yes, I love Exodus. When people talk about how much they like Exodus, they don't typically say things like, oh, that part where it describes the garments the priests wear. I love that part. I get it. I understand that. But turns out, as we're looking at today, turns out that the priesthood, God instituting and establishing a way to have a relationship with him through an intermediary, the priesthood, which actually today's section has 28 more verses than the crossing of the Red Sea and the Song of Victory afterward, turns out that the priesthood is far more important than we might think, which is why so much space goes into it. Let me say it like this. Being freed from slavery in Egypt, even while plundering the Egyptians and coming out with untold riches you could never possibly have dreamt of before, all of that ultimately doesn't matter at all without a mediator that makes atonement for sin and a relationship with the holy God possible. And part of what's so cool about establishing the priesthood that we'll see today is something that's very clear from the very beginning of the first of these 5 sections we'll look at today. And that's this: first, that God initiates, God establishes a holy priesthood. And he initiates this priesthood to bridge the divine-human gap. God's the one who's initiating the way for sinful humanity and a holy God to be in relationship. Remember, God said, I'm doing this, I'm having you build this tabernacle and putting in these furnishings, and here establishing people among you who will be doing priest things. I'm establishing this so that I can dwell with you. Jump into Exodus 28, starting in verse 1, where God commands Moses, says, then bring near to you. Bring near to you. The word you there is singular. Speaking to Moses, God speaking to Moses, highlighting here Moses' leadership and oversight role among the Israelites. He says, then bring near to you Aaron, your brother, and his sons with him from among the people of Israel. Why? To serve me as priests, Aaron and Aaron's sons. And then these 2 pairs next here are a smidge of foreshadowing in the story, narrative foreshadowing and warning. Bring near to you to serve me as priests, Aaron and Aaron's sons. And here are the 2 pairs. First, Nadab and Abihu, who would eventually come to represent corruption and faithlessness and approaching God as a priest shouldn't. And then also Eleazar and Ithamar, who would come to represent faithfulness, approaching God as one ought. There's much more in the footnote if you'd like to see what we're talking about there. Now, two things to notice here. We're going to spend a bit of time here because it establishes for this whole section some important stuff. Two things to notice here. First, we call this type of priesthood the Aaronic, A-A-R, not ironic or Irenic, but Aaronic. That's funny to me, probably only me. The Aaronic priesthood, as we see here in verse 1, because they all come from the line of Aaron, Moses' brother. Moses, not so great a speaker. Aaron, good with the words. Aaron, Moses' brother, here is the priest. And there are two types of priests in the Old Testament, as opposed to the Levitical priesthood, which was mostly responsible for hands-on care and maintenance of the tabernacle and the furnishings and assisting with practical things in terms of the worship and what would happen. The Aaronic priests, the Aaron priests, were the spiritual overseers who carried out more of the actual offerings and sacrifices. Sort of like the Aaronic priests, the Aaron priests would do the actual sacrifices and lead the actual prayers and the worship service kinds of things. The Levitical priests would bring them to the Aaronic priests. And they were responsible for setting up the tabernacle and things like that. So those of y'all who are in portable campuses and you're setting up and taking down Levitical priesthood, what's up? So it's roughly like we think about with New Testament elders and deacons, spiritual oversight, the Aaronic priesthood, and more practical hands-on maintenance is like deacons. Okay, so this is God establishing the Aaronic priesthood, Aaronic. Now, secondly, important to notice here, notice that God tells Moses, who is already set apart by God as a leader and mediator. He's also already viewed by the people as such, as an authority. God directs Moses to bring near, key word, to bring near Aaron and his sons to serve him as priests. Now, this word bring near, along with the context of God establishing a priesthood to serve as mediator between God and people. Bring near is intended to communicate the movement from the profane to the sacred. In this particular instance, sometimes it's used the other direction. But to draw near is the unholy, profane, sinful humanity being consecrated or set apart to draw near to a holy God. It's a word that's most often used in contexts of approaching God, especially to speak of doing so in a particular way because of his holiness. You can't just approach God as you want. You have to draw near in a particular kind of way because he's holy. And this special word, draw near, is used all over the Old Testament especially, some equivalents in the New Testament, but it's used in the Old Testament to speak of how you have to approach God because he's holy. In Leviticus 1, at the very beginning of an entire book there, Leviticus, that's focused on the holiness of God and how to atone for sin because of blood sacrifice that has to be made. God says that when the people bring near their offerings, the ordinary stuff that they're bringing near, their offerings, that stuff is set apart for sacred purposes. It's made holy by God. In Leviticus 10, verse 3, God says that those who are near to him will be sanctified, set apart, and made holy because of God's presence, because it's for God's purposes. In Numbers 3, God tells Moses to bring the tribe of Levi near so that they could minister as priests. And so the language of drawing near here in Exodus 28:1 is about the movement from the profane to the sacred. God making a way, in this case, for ordinary people to take on kind of a holy status for performing sacred duties. Now, that's what a priest is. An ordinary person that happens to be set apart by God for God's purposes. And in this case, the purpose of acting as a mediator between sinful people and a holy God. Now, this set-apartness and mediator role, mediator, priest, same idea, it's obvious throughout our passage that all of these elements were about drawing near to God. And drawing near to God in the way that he prescribed was the only way to draw near to God. Look at verses 2 and following. He says, this is again God speaking to Moses, "You shall make holy garments for Aaron your brother for glory and for beauty." Now these garments are holy not because there's something inherent about the clothing themselves, but because of being set apart for God's purposes. Because when God's a part of something, it becomes holy in that sense. So both priests here and their clothing are set apart for God's purposes. Why? Like all the other elements of the things we've been looking at in the tabernacle, its furnishings, the reasons they did the things they did in the worship, it was to point to God's holiness, to point to his character and his nature. In this case, the holy garments are to be for glory and for beauty. They were to be striking. They were to be spectacular, not normal clothing, but different and special clothing, so that when the priests wore that clothing, it would remind the people of God's glory, of God's character. This is why in verse 3, they were made with great care and skill. This wasn't the kind of thing you just go to the local store to get. Someone who painstakingly put it together skillfully with the best of the best kinds of materials. That's how this was supposed to happen. Because God's not, something you just get off the shelf at Walmart or even Target. It takes special skill. That's why it says in verse 3, "You shall speak to all the skillful whom I have filled with a spirit of skill, that they," those who are set apart by God for his purposes, "whom I have filled with a spirit of skill, that they may make Aaron's garments to consecrate him, to set him apart from my priesthood." So, even all of the skillful ones in verse 3, they were set apart for the purpose of pointing to his glory and beauty. Which means, in case you're not tracking, the tabernacle, its furnishings, the structures, the lights, the sights, the smells, the people, the clothing, the things in the clothing, all of it was meant to be set apart as an offering of worship to point to the holiness of a God who isn't approached on their terms, on our terms. To make clear that you approach a holy God as he says you approach him. Right down to every single detail of the priest's garments, which themselves pointed to a God of glory and beauty. So verse 4, "These are the garments they shall make." We'll show you more of these in detail in the next section, but for now, keep reading in verses 4 and 5. "These are the garments they shall make: a breast piece, which covered the chest and the heart, an ephod, which is like a apron or a robe, a coat of checker work, a turban, and a sash. They shall make holy garments for Aaron your brother and his sons to serve me as priests. They shall receive," remember this from last week, "gold, blue, purple, and scarlet yarns, and fine twined linens." They were to be made of the best and the finest and the rarest possible yarns and linens and materials. They were meant to be valuable. They were meant to be long-lasting. They were meant to be beautiful. And they were meant to be crafted carefully and well so that they would last, so that they would point to permanence. Because again, everything in their worship practices was meant to point to God's holiness and their own lack of holiness. So drawing near to a righteous and holy God whose glory and beauty deserved better than the best. To bring anything other than perfection into God's presence, even just symbolically for them, is to not just realize, but to be judged by one's own sin. So, as we saw last week, with the veils that went over and around and were inside the tabernacle, many of which were made with the same kind of blue and purple and scarlet yarn and fine twined linens. Yes, it's meant to point to the unbridgeable gap between them and God, but it's also, at the same time, meant to point to the hope of a mediator. So like we saw in blue, purple, scarlet yarns, and fine twined linen, we have a movement from God, blue, heaven, as it represented, to man by way of royalty, purple, earthly authority. So we had heaven, God's presence, blue, purple, earthly authority, where still God was sovereign, down to scarlet. Blue was a dye that was made from rare fish. I didn't mention this a whole lot last week, maybe even at all. But blue was the rarest because you had to get it from rare fish, and it took a lot of work, and it took a lot of people, and it took a lot of money, and not many people had it. In fact, almost nobody had blue colored dye. Some had purple because the royalty had purple, but just about everybody had scarlet. It was common. And so that movement from blue to purple to scarlet, and we could establish this in a bunch of places in the scriptures, was also meant to point to not just the unbridgeable gap, but the hope that the gap could be bridged by a God who comes from where his fullness dwells, even in an earthly authority where he is still king, to sinful humanity represented by the red. And we would see this not just in the veils, not just in the ephod, but throughout a number of places. So, even here, as with the rest of the garments, as with the veils in the tabernacle, it points to both God's holiness and humanity's sinfulness, but also hints at a hope of a mediator. All right, now in the second of 5 sections, where we will begin to considerably pick it up in terms of our speed, don't worry. God gives instructions for number 2, the ephod. The ephod, it's kind of an apron where this is about God bearing the people before God in remembrance, which is a bit of a weird way to say it. It'll make sense from the text in just a second here. Jump into verse 6, where we'll begin reading all the way through verse 14 before we show you a picture on screen. It says this: "And they shall make the ephod of gold, of," here we go again, "blue and purple and scarlet yarn, and a fine twined linen, skillfully worked. It shall have 2 shoulder pieces attached to its edges, so that it may be joined together. Togetherness, just like the structure of the tabernacle, was important to speak of permanence that points to God's eternality and his promises and his faithfulness. Verses 8 and following: "The skillfully woven band on it shall be made like it and be of one piece with it, joined together of one piece with it, of gold, blue, purple, and scarlet yarn, and fine twined linens. You shall take 2 onyx stones and engrave on them the names of the sons of Israel, 6 on each, 6 of their names on the one stone, and the names of the remaining 6 in the other, in the order of their birth. And as a jeweler engraves signets, so shall you engrave the 2 stones with the names of the sons of Israel, and enclose them in settings of gold filigree, so that they would be permanently attached there. And set those 2 stones on the shoulder pieces of the apron, the ephod, as stones of remembrance for the sons of Israel. And Aaron shall bear their names before the Lord on his 2 shoulders for remembrance, You shall make settings of gold filigree, 2 chains of pure gold, twisted like cords, and you shall attach the corded chains to the settings. Now here's approximately what it looked like. Ish. We don't know for sure. And if you look online at pictures, they will look like variations of this. But the ephod, which is the blue apron-looking part here, it was made of the same materials as the tabernacle curtains and veils were, as noted in verses 6 to 8. And the color was meant to be blue, a visual connection to heaven, where God's presence dwells in fullness. So to look at the priest was primarily to see blue. To look at the priest was to think of God's presence. Now, verses 9 to 11 describe 2 onyx stones engraved with the names of the 12 sons of Israel. Those 2 stones were set in gold filigree in a permanent kind of a setting to keep them there as stones of remembrance, they're called in verse 12. And they were attached to corded chains. They were attached to chains to keep it all together and tight as a symbol of permanence and security of God's presence and God's promises. Now notice that these stones of remembrance are stones of God not forgetting to carry out his promises. This kind of remembering, which is about God acting redemptively for his people, this kind of remembering is all over the scriptures in both the Old and New Testaments. This word about God remembering is an action on behalf of his people kind of a word. It's in Genesis 9 when it speaks of God remembering the covenant he made with Noah. In Exodus 2 speaks of God remembering his covenant, his promises with the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Same in Psalm 106, Isaiah 49, Luke 1, Hebrews 8, just to name a few. And the New Testament even has a word that it grabs from the Old Testament as it was translated in Greek from our passage to speak of remembrance in the New Testament as well. So here in Exodus 28, notice that the priest bears the stones of remembrance where the names of God's people are engraved on his shoulders, bears them on his shoulders before God as priest. So the priest is kind of carrying the burden of the people into God's presence. Third section here, we'll talk about the breastpiece, which is about securing divine guidance for God's people, both in where the breastpiece was over the heart of the priest and what was in it and what they represented. This time we'll show you the picture as we read and keep it up there and describe each purpose as we go. So in verse 15 it says, "You shall make a breastpiece of judgment which connects it to divine decision-making, wisdom, direction, divine decision-making, as well as justice. You shall make a breastpiece of judgment in skilled work. In the style of the ephod you shall make it." Again, the hope of God's presence and authority among our scarlet sin, just like so many other elements in their worship. In the style of the ephod you shall make it of gold, blue, and purple, and scarlet yarns and fine twined linen shall you make it. It shall be square and doubled, a span its length and a span its breadth, which would make it into kind of a little pouch, where on top of this pouch, on the front there, verse 17, you shall set it in 4 rows of stones. 4 times 3, 12. A row of sardius, topaz, carbuncle shall be the first row, the second an emerald, sapphire, diamond, the third a jacinth, agate, amethyst, the fourth the beryl, onyx, and jasper, each different than the other. Together, to show that God will take care of all of his people, but individually to show that, God doesn't forget any one of them. They shall be set in gold filigree, which is about permanence as well as beauty. There shall be 12 stones with their names according to the names of the sons of Israel. There shall be like signets, each engraved with its name for the 12 tribes. Now notice in verses 22 through 8 here, it's fastened to the ephod with gold chains and rings to emphasize a sense of security. The people are attached strongly to the ephod to emphasize the security of Israel's position before God. You shall make for the breastpiece twisted chains like cords of pure gold, and you shall make for the breastpiece 2 rings of gold, and put the 2 rings on the 2 edges of the breastpiece, and you shall put the 2 cords of gold in the 2 rings at the edges of the breastpiece. The 2 ends of the 2 cords you shall attach to the 2 settings of filigree. You get the idea. Reading on through to verse 28, notice, they shall bind, keep it permanent, secure, bind the breastpiece by its rings to the rings of the ephod with a lace of blue, so that it may lie in the skillfully woven band of the ephod, so that the breastpiece shall not come loose from the ephod. Now, verse 29. So Aaron shall bear the names of the sons of Israel in the breastpiece of judgment. Notice, on his heart. When he bears their names before God, it's on his heart, because God doesn't forget, he remembers. His people are on God's heart, his heart, as symbolized by being on the front of the priest's heart. So that when he goes into the holy place, verse 29, he will bring them to regular remembrance before the Lord. And then verse 30, in that you shall put, and we don't really know much about this, it's kind of like praying and casting lots and God guide us kind of a thing-ish, but we don't know. In the breastpiece of judgment you shall put the Urim and the Thummim. So we know it's about divine guidance. But the important part is bearing the people before God regularly, because they are on his heart. That's the mediatorial priestly function. They shall be on Aaron's heart when he goes in before the Lord. What a cool verse. God's people will be on Aaron's heart when he goes in before the Lord to make atonement, to bear judgment for them. Thus, Aaron shall bear the judgment of the people of Israel on his heart before the Lord regularly. Now, in the 4th section, we have what we're just calling additional garments, emphasizing holiness in every aspect of priestly service. We'll just read and describe a bit of it here. You shall make the robe olive blue. You shall have an opening for the head in the middle of it, because place for the head. On its hem, verse 33, you shall make pomegranates of blue and purple and scarlet yarns, again, around its hem with bells of gold between them. Verse 35, it shall be on Aaron when he ministers, and its sound shall be heard when he goes into the holy place before the Lord once a year to make atonement for the people, and when he comes out, so that he does not die. Meaning, there are probably 2 thoughts. One, if the bells stop ringing and the priest is in the back and it's been a while and they don't hear anything, then maybe something happened back there and we should probably go check on him. Or, also, the hearing of that ringing of the bells says to the people who can't see it, they don't know what's happening, but they can hear it. They know that something is happening behind that veil where they can't see, where the high priest is making atonement for them. And it's a reminder of God accepting the sacrifice on behalf of their sin so that he can be in their presence and they can have relationship. So, verse 36, a plate of pure gold engraved on it like the engraving of a signet, holy to the Lord, which is a statement, an identity statement, set apart for God's purposes on the head, the hat. You shall fasten it on the turban by a cord of blue, on the front of the turban, on Aaron's forehead. He shall bear any guilt from the holy things that the people of Israel consecrate as their holy gifts, that they may be accepted before the Lord. It goes on to describe the sash, the tunic, the undergarments. In other words, all the way down to the underwear, which was meant to cover nakedness and emphasize modesty. Every single piece of the garments that the priests wore were meant to point to both the divide between God's holiness and their sinfulness, and that coverage and atonement and a way to have relationship with God was also a part of all that. So we are not going to read all of chapter 29, but this is about the ritual of ordaining the Aaronic priesthood, of ordaining that priest for this service, or consecrating it, consecrating him to be the mediator between God and Israel. I'll let you read all that. Basically, it begins the sacrificial system that we will talk about more later on anyway. So read that for yourself later on. This is how they begin. So, 3 quick takeaway thoughts related to this initiating or establishing the priesthood by God, by which they could draw near. So the first is, and we see this in the last few weeks and this week, God's holiness demands our careful preparation and not our casual dregs. Dregs is a weird word, perhaps for some of you may not know what dregs are. When you get to the bottom of a, let's say, not made at Catalyst Coffee Company cup of coffee, and they didn't clean out the carafes well, perhaps, you get a lot of those little grains in the bottom. Those are the dregs. It's the leftover stuff. It's not just that. There are a number of other ways that dregs happen, but it's the stuff that's left over if you haven't been careful. What's clear this week, last week, the preceding weeks, is that every single little detail required attention, required work, required planning, required intentionality. They were to be careful to prepare everything that they were doing so that, as God says at the very beginning, in chapter 25, so shall you make it. Exactly as I tell you, so shall you make it. Why? Because a perfect, holy God doesn't just deserve, turns out he actually demands and cannot do otherwise, demands the kind of perfect preparation that points to who he really is. For us, in practical terms, we can apply this by saying, if he is as Scripture says, our casual, thoughtless, unintentional, kind of careless way of preparing, you name it. We're not just talking about the context of worship, we're talking about all of life as an act of worship and service to a holy God. When we come to him as if we can draw near to him on our terms, it's a way of saying, you know, there's an extent to which, God, I don't really think that you're as holy as you say you are. God's holiness actually demands the kind of preparation and consecration to approach him as holy. Not that we can, because we can't, but insofar as we're able, we should. If you want your life to be worship offered back to him, that is how someone who actually believes he's holy and understands that they are not, approaches him. That's how they offer themselves to a God who's holy. Am I going to be wearing elaborate priestly garments next week? No, I'm not. But I am going to be careful and thoughtful so that I'm not wearing something that offends, that distracts, that somehow doesn't help point to God's holiness. I mean, I took a shower this morning, like I do every morning, and I shaved, which if you didn't shave and you have facial hair, that's fine, that's cool. I just can't grow it very well. It looks really bad. But casual and careless, you name it, is inappropriate before a God who deserves our best. Look up Hebrews 12, 28 and 29 later on. This isn't just an Old Testament concept. God is still holy. He's still a consuming fire. He will return in judgment. Why? Because his holiness will still deal with all sin and evil and death. Hebrews 12, 28 and 29. Second quick thought is that God's holiness deserves our best when it comes to our priestly service. Long story short, Exodus 19 says, I'm calling you, God speaking, to be a kingdom of priests, which at the time must have sounded strange to them. But now we know, because we have Jesus as our great high priest, because he is righteousness for us, and his sacrifice as a perfect, sinless substitute on our behalf means that it works to save us, and his righteousness is our righteousness. Because we have him as our priest, we can function to be mediators on God's behalf to others. And if you're going to be a mediator to others on God's behalf, might I suggest you do it in a way so that your best, so that excellence, so that care is what's communicated, so that that's what people see? Look up 1 Peter 2, 9 and 10 later on. 1 Peter 2, 9 and 10. And then finally, thirdly, Christ is the great high priest. Christ is the great high priest whose righteousness is our confidence to draw near to the throne of grace. We talked early on in Exodus 28, verse 1, about how everything that followed was meant to point to what was necessary to draw near to God. We know because of Christ, as it says in Hebrews 4, we'll put this on screen, Hebrews 4, 14 to 16, we know that we have a great high priest. When it speaks about Christ as our great high priest, the writer of Hebrews is comparing it to things like we read today in Exodus. We don't have priests or high priests who did offerings of worship and sacrifice that simply pointed to the Messiah, in whom faith for them was likewise saving. We don't have that. We have a high priest who, it says, since then we have a great high priest who passed through the heavens, which is where God in his presence and fullness dwells. So we have a high priest who's been in God's presence and made it through righteous, made it through not judged, made it through alive. Things that for us would not have happened. So since then we have a great high priest who's passed through the heavens, namely Jesus, the Son of God. The writer of Hebrews here says, let us hold fast to our confession. Our confession, our belief in that truth. For we don't have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, meaning the kind of mediator that actually works has to be human, fully, and divine, fully. The only kind of mediator that works would be a mediator who can bridge the human-divine gap and come out unscathed. And we have a great high priest, not one who's unable to sympathize, but who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sin, which is why we can then with confidence draw near to the throne of grace to receive mercy and grace in time of need. Friends, I don't know about you, so much of life, I know I have a confession in a great high priest whose righteousness is my righteousness. But I fail to draw near to that throne of grace with a kind of confidence that believes that's true. I act, I talk, I serve in ways that may make others, and I know for me, I think, man, my confidence is not that great. I want to live, speak, act, behave with others in a way that shows that I hold fast to the confession that even if I fail, even if I say something silly up front here or go 12 and a half minutes over time, my confidence isn't what you think of me. It's in the throne of grace. That's the only chance any of us has. Which is why we can come to him in confidence, draw near, based on the righteousness of Christ. And it's the same reason we can offer our lives with the kind of abandon that goes where he wants, that gives what he wants, so the people are pointed to him. I don't know about you, friends, but sometimes I get tired of offering casual dregs and second-rate service. I want people to know God and to be in his presence. Because what better thing can there be for any of us? So ask yourselves these questions, and then we'll pray and close up. Where in your life are you offering God casual dregs or second-rate service? And what do you need to change this week to begin serving him with the confidence that Christ is your great high priest? Father in heaven, we're here today because the only chance we have, the only confidence that's worth serving from and living from is the confidence that comes in you being perfect, you making a way, you establishing a priesthood, you showing us in all these various ways that we're studying today that you're a God who not only deserves but ultimately also demands perfection. And so, Lord, we come to you with open hands, acknowledging that we can't do that. And also, Lord, being grateful that only you can, and you've made a way for us to have a relationship with you through Jesus. We're forever grateful that our confidence comes from his righteousness, that achieved for us grace so that we could come to you on our knees, grateful that you've made a way for us in Christ, in whose name we pray.